So I'm going to tell you the story about Bear 56. She's pretty special. So bears in general in Minnesota live until about 10 years of age. And so this one is the oldest known bear in the wild ever recorded. She lived to 39 and a half years of age and lived in Minnesota. So she was collared near Grand Rapids in the early 80s at 7 years old. And so we didn't have her collared as a cub, but in general, we're able to figure out how old she was from her teeth. And so we tracked her from the early 80s all the way until she died in 2014. She basically was blind and deaf by the end. Her eyes were so full of cataracts she could hardly see, and people would look out for her in general because she had been there in the area so long. But people would honk their horn and she wouldn't even react. And if you came up from downwind, you probably could touch her with a stick and she wouldn't realize till you touched her. And so her jaws, her teeth were just totally ruined. All that's left, this is a 3D print of her skull, and all that was left were her incisor holes here. She had a few busted roots of canines, but almost nothing above the gums. She was missing her lower left canine, and then had a real short lower right canine, and again, just nothing but sockets. And you know, we just don't see bears this old very often. There are a few that are shot every year in their 30s, but you know, high 20s is very old for a bear, and you know, 30s is almost unheard of. So she had her first cubs, I believe, at 5, and then every other year thereafter until she turned 25. And then she was essentially barren from there on out. And so she hit her reproductive senescence, or her menopause, around 25, and for the next 10 years had no cubs. And so she was just solitary on her own. And once she stopped having cubs, she moved to a different study area, or I should say a different part of the study area, about 15 or so kilometers to the northeast. And that's where she lived out her days, not too far from Scenic State Park in Big Fork. In general, we only have bears collared for a few years before they inevitably get shot, or we focus on a different part of the study. But for her, she was collared in 1981 or 1982 at 7 years of age. And then every spring, we would have to go check her collar, change it, adjust it. And so essentially, she was collared almost all of her whole life once she hit that age of 7. And you'd think by the end of it she would smell us and just be so sick of dealing with us towards the end, but you know, we kept hanging on as long as she did. And in 2014, we would check in with her every so often via VHF. And in 2014, the mortality signal happened in midsummer, and we found her up in her home range, just laying peacefully out in the woods. And we're able to recover her skull, and now we're able to make 3D prints from it with our collaborators at the university. So she was really typical, 225 pounds or so in March, and so that's just spot on average for our females in the Chippewa National Forest study area. And so we have, I believe, 4 or 5 generations of her offspring were collared over the years. And so we collared her daughter, at least one of her granddaughters, and then her great-granddaughter, and I believe one more after that. And you know, if we trace the DNA between her and a lot of the bears in the study area, I imagine they would be a lot in common. And so for you hunters out there, if you happen to see a bear with cattle-style ear tags, that generally means it's collared. And so we use the information from these bears directly to inform our population models, and that's how we set quotas. And so if you wouldn't mind passing on any collared bears that come through the area, the information that we get is totally invaluable. You know, we would have never known how old this bear would have gotten. She's the only known bear in all of our study areas to ever have died of old age, period. And so without that information, we just would have never known that. And so we thank hunters for passing on these bears when they come across them, and we'll do our part to make sure that you have plenty of opportunity and we keep the bear population healthy, happy, and resilient.